Have you ever noticed how some people seem to learn faster than everyone else? Not because they're smarter, not because they have better memories, and definitely not because they spend every waking hour studying. Yet somehow, they absorb information faster, connect ideas more easily, and solve problems that leave everyone else stuck. So what's their secret? What if I told you that most schools never teach the single mental shortcut that makes learning dramatically easier, a shortcut used by top performers, elite athletes, successful entrepreneurs, and some of the most effective thinkers in history? And once you understand it, you'll never look at learning the same way again. Because the biggest lie many people believe is that learning is about collecting information. It isn't. Think about it. Every day, millions of students sit through classes, take notes, memorize facts, and prepare for exams. Then a few weeks later, most of that information disappears. Gone. Not because they didn't try, not because they were lazy, because their brains were never designed to store isolated facts. Your brain doesn't naturally think in lists, it thinks in patterns, and that changes everything. Imagine walking into a forest. You see thousands of leaves, thousands of branches, thousands of details. Trying to memorize every single leaf would be impossible. But the moment you recognize the pattern called tree, your brain compresses all that information into a simple mental model. Instead of remembering thousands of details, you remember one structure. That's exactly how powerful learners think. They don't focus on individual facts, they focus on patterns. And this is the mental shortcut schools rarely mention. The shortcut is simple: learn the framework before the details. Most people do the opposite. They start collecting facts immediately. Formulas, rules, statistics. Their brains become overloaded. The information feels disconnected, and learning becomes exhausting. But high performers start differently. Before diving into details, they ask one question: what is the big picture? Because once the framework is clear, every new piece of information has a place to go. Think of a puzzle. If someone dumped 1,000 puzzle pieces onto a table and removed the picture from the box, the challenge would feel overwhelming. But the moment you see the image on the cover, everything changes. The individual pieces suddenly make sense. Learning works the same way. Without a framework, information feels random. With a framework, information becomes obvious. This explains why some students can spend 10 hours studying and still struggle, while others spend 3 hours and understand more. The difference isn't effort. The difference is structure. Take history, for example. Many students try memorizing endless dates and events. Painful, boring, and difficult. But imagine learning the major forces first. Economic pressure, political power, human ambition, technological change. Now every historical event becomes part of a larger story. Instead of hundreds of disconnected facts, you see a pattern. The same principle applies everywhere. Business, psychology, science, fitness, money, relationships. Every field contains underlying frameworks, and once you understand those frameworks, learning accelerates dramatically. But there's another reason this shortcut is so powerful. Your brain loves efficiency. In fact, your brain is constantly searching for ways to reduce effort. That's why habits exist. That's why routines form. And that's why frameworks work so well. They reduce cognitive load. Instead of solving every problem from scratch, you use existing mental models. Consider driving a car. When you first learn, every action requires conscious attention. The steering wheel, the mirrors, the pedals, the traffic signs. Everything feels overwhelming. But eventually, your brain builds a framework, and suddenly driving feels automatic. The complexity hasn't disappeared. Your brain simply compressed it. That process is one of the greatest superpowers humans possess. Compression. The ability to transform complexity into simplicity. And the people who master this skill gain an enormous advantage. Look at successful entrepreneurs. They often make decisions faster than everyone else. Why? Because they've built frameworks. Instead of analyzing every situation from zero, they recognize familiar patterns. The situation may look new, but the underlying structure feels familiar. This allows them to move quickly while others remain stuck in analysis. The same thing happens with expert doctors, expert investors, expert athletes, expert musicians. They are processing every detail individually. They're recognizing patterns, and that recognition creates speed. There's actually a famous story involving chess masters. Researchers compared grandmasters to average players. At first glance, it seemed obvious that grandmasters simply had better memories. But the truth was more interesting. When researchers placed chess pieces in realistic game positions, grandmasters remembered far more pieces than beginners. However, when the pieces were arranged randomly, their advantage nearly disappeared. Why? Because they weren't memorizing pieces. They were recognizing patterns. That's the secret. Experts see structures, beginners see details, and schools often train students to focus on details first, which makes learning harder than it needs to be. So how can you apply this immediately? Start with a simple rule. Before learning anything, spend a few minutes identifying the framework. Ask questions like, what are the major categories? What are the key principles? What are the repeating patterns? What are the fundamental rules? What is causing everything else? These questions force your brain to search for structure, and structure is where understanding begins. For example, imagine you want to learn personal finance. Most people immediately start watching random videos. Budgeting, investing, credit scores, taxes, retirement accounts. The information quickly becomes overwhelming. Instead, start with a framework. Money comes in, money goes out. The difference creates wealth. Everything else exists inside that structure. Now every financial concept has context. The learning process becomes dramatically easier. The same approach works for fitness. Instead of memorizing hundreds of workout routines, understand the core framework. Progressive overload, recovery, nutrition, consistency. Almost every fitness strategy fits somewhere inside those pillars. Again, complexity becomes simplicity. But there's an even deeper lesson here. Many people believe intelligence is something you're born with, a fixed trait, something you either have or don't have. Yet when you observe exceptional learners, something surprising appears. They're often not gathering more information than everyone else. They're organizing information better. That distinction matters, because organization can be learned. Framework thinking can be learned. Pattern recognition can be trained, which means learning itself can be improved, because it shifts the focus away from talent and towards strategy. Imagine two people reading the same book. One highlights random sentences, the other searches for the core framework. A year later, who remembers more? Usually the person who understood the structure, because information attached to a framework is easier to retrieve. The brain loves connections. The more connections an idea has, the stronger it becomes. This explains why storytelling is so powerful. Stories create frameworks naturally. Characters, goals, conflicts, resolutions. The human brain evolved to remember stories because stories organize information. Facts fade, stories stick, frameworks stick, patterns stick, and that brings us to one of the biggest mistakes people make when learning. They confuse familiarity with understanding. Reading something twice feels productive. Highlighting paragraphs feels productive. Watching another video feels productive. But often, it creates only the illusion of learning. Real learning happens when you can explain the framework in your own words. If you can describe the structure clearly, the details become easier to remember. If you can't describe the structure, you probably don't understand the subject yet. This simple test reveals more than hours of passive studying. Try it today. Pick any topic, then challenge yourself to explain its core framework in 60 seconds. No notes, no textbook, no internet, just your own understanding. If you struggle, you've identified exactly where your learning should focus, not on more information, on better structure. Because knowledge without structure is noise. Knowledge with structure becomes power. And once you start thinking this way, something remarkable happens. You begin seeing frameworks everywhere, in conversations, in businesses, in books, in social trends, in human behavior. The world starts looking less chaotic. Patterns emerge, connections appear, complexity shrinks, and learning accelerates. That's why this mental shortcut is so valuable. It doesn't just help you study, it changes how you think. Instead of asking what are all the details, you begin asking what is the underlying pattern. That single shift can save years of frustration, years of confusion, years of wasted effort. Because successful learners don't necessarily know more, they understand more. And understanding always beats memorization in the long run. So the next time you decide to learn something new, resist the temptation to dive straight into the details. Pause, step back, Look for the framework, find the pattern, understand the structure, then let the details fall into place. You may discover that learning was never supposed to feel as difficult as you were taught. And if you found this idea valuable, remember this: the people who move ahead fastest in life are rarely the ones collecting the most information. They're the ones organizing information most effectively. Because in a world overflowing with knowledge, the real advantage isn't knowing more, it's seeing the pattern that everyone else misses.